Namaste and good evening. I'm Rishi Mutada, board member at the Hindu American Foundation based in Houston, Texas. The Hindu American Foundation, HAF, is an educational and advocacy organization established in 2003. HAF focuses on educating the public about Hindus and Hinduism and advocating for policies and practices that ensure the well-being of all people and the planet. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit, tax-exempt public charity pursuant to Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. On behalf of the Foundation's entire board of directors, I'd like to welcome all of you to day 2 of our first ever virtual advocacy forum, Dharma Advocacy, Empowering Hindus at Home and Abroad. We hope you had the chance to join us yesterday to hear from a great lineup of speakers focusing on foreign policy issues and Hindu human rights. Please do engage with us on social media using hashtag HAFADFO2020. And if you're interested in learning more about advocacy, we have a special Dharma Advocates training coming up on October 1st. Register at www.hinduamerican.org, and the link is under upcoming events. Space is limited. Today, we're going to be bringing the discussion a little closer to home and hearing from several speakers about domestic policy issues, with a particular focus on challenges and opportunities for Hindus at the local and state level. At the Hindu American Foundation, we've made local and state advocacy a priority, as these issues have a direct impact on the daily lives of Hindu Americans. We have a great program in store for you. Before we get started, we have a special invocation by Hindu American vocal artist, Vindhya Adappa. Vindhya is a 2014 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She currently serves as the Associate General Counsel of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an international and refugee resettlement agency. HIAS is the world's oldest refugee resettlement agency. She has also worked in the private sector, at the United Nations, and in Africa. Vindhya recently made her singing debut with a Bollywood release by Z Music of the song Chel Mere Bia, a peppy song composed by Anuj Garg. Vindhya says she's driven by a desire to use her voice with intention, inspiration, and change. You can follow her on Instagram at Vindhi Music.
वक्रतुण्ड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभा निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देवा सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा। ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः।
Thank you, Vindhya, for that beautiful invocation. I just wanted to add a few words to explain the significance of the invocation dedicated to Lord Ganesh and for the Gayatri Mantra. Ganesh, the manifestation of the divine who removes obstacles, is invoked at the beginning of any endeavor for his blessings. The shloka to Ganesh means, O Lord Ganesha, with a curved trunk, large body, and the brilliance of a million suns. May my efforts be free of obstacles, always. The second mantra was the Gayatri Mantra. By chanting this powerful mantra, we pray for spiritual unfoldment. It means, may the light of consciousness come to shine forth its radiance through my intellect. Thus, may perception of the world be clear, may discernment be subtle, my judgments be correct and quick, may comprehensions of situations be precise and wise. We are now honored to have a special address from the New York State Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Heastie. Carl E. Heastie is the 100th Speaker of the New York State Assembly. He has the historic distinction of being the first African American to serve as leader of the Chamber's 150 members, representing communities across the state of New York. Speaker Heastie represents the 83rd Assembly District in the Northeast Bronx and was first elected to the Assembly in 2000. During his time in the New York State Assembly, he has championed solutions to major issues facing the state, such as K-12 and higher education reforms, health and human services legislation, labor reform, transportation, combating domestic violence, and empowering the youth. He earned a master's degree in business administration with a concentration in finance from Baruch College of City University of New York, and a bachelor's degree in applied mathematics and statistics from Stony Brook University. HAF has been working with Speaker Heastie over the past few months to ensure that the swastika bill in New York that would teach the swastika as a hate symbol without any context on the ancient and whole sacred use by Hindus does not move forward as is. Speaker Heastie has listened to and understood the concerns of the Hindu American community and learned from us about the real significance of the swastika, so any bill on this issue that moves has agreement on the language and meaning of the swastika to both acknowledge and recognize the misappropriation of the symbol by Nazi Germany, which is better described as a Hakenkreuz, and that also recognizes the ancient, peaceful, and sacred use of the symbol by Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, and some Native American traditions. Krishna, please play Speaker Heastie's remarks.
Hi, I'm Carl Heastie, Speaker of the New York State Assembly. I know that we cannot be together in person for this year's Hindu American Foundation Conference, but I'm so glad that we can come together virtually to acknowledge your dedication to education and advocacy. On behalf of all of my colleagues in the People's House, I want to thank you. We are tremendously grateful for the work that you do, not just for the Hindu American community, but for all of the people of our state. In this difficult time across the country, as we are struggling with the impacts of inequality and division at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic is wreaking havoc on our communities, your work is more important now than ever. Challenges like these shake us to our core. They force us to adapt. They remind us to care for each other, and they stress that despite the need to be apart physically, we are stronger together. This pandemic has forced us to change the way we go about our daily lives and interact with the world. We have to rethink our priorities and the way we do almost everything. Living rooms have become offices. Kids are learning in new and creative ways, and we in the legislature have had to find new ways to pass meaningful laws to make all our communities better. I am proud that since I became Speaker, we have made critical investments in our communities. We have passed legislation to encourage equal rights for all New Yorkers, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation.
We apologize for the technical issue with the speaker's video, but we thank him for those inspiring words and for working with the Hindu American community. Much of HAF's work at the local and state level has revolved around education and ensuring that Hinduism in India are represented in an accurate manner in K-12 textbooks. In California, for instance, we've been working on textbook reform for over 15 years. The next video we have is from a State Board of Education video in California in 2016 and shows what HAF and the Hindu American community are trying to achieve in improving textbooks and how anti-Hindu hate groups such as Equality Labs, South Asian History for All, and others have actively sought to distort Hinduism.
Hindu fundamentalist forces are manufacturing and erasing history.
India has nearly 40% of the world modern slaves, many of them Dalits, forced into slavery due to violence connected to caste.
Their daughters are raped and hanged on the trees for 3 days.
Hinduism, they try to killing Dalits.
It's only when I came to the United States that I learned about what an oppressive construct Hinduism is. The kids who will be talking to you today will not even hear about that at home or in their communities. This is an opportunity for you folks to actually tell them what an oppressive construct the religion is.
My name is Mihir Megani. I'm speaking on behalf of a broad coalition that supports the recommendations of the Social Science, Religion, and Faculty Group to preserve Hindu and Jain identity, equitably represent women's roles in ancient India, and equitably represent social structures across all societies.
We ask that you restore references to Hinduism in grade 6 that were removed and replaced with arbitrary and ahistorical language. We ask that you do not conflate caste with Hindu religious teachings, and that we ask that while recognizing patriarchy as a historical reality, you also recognize the unique contributions of Hindu women in ancient India.
We just want all contributions from people of all castes to be represented. For example, Valmiki, a man from a lower caste, wrote one of the greatest pieces of literature in India.
I urge the board to adopt a framework that is accurate, culturally competent, and treats Hinduism with the same level of dignity that is afforded to other religions.
Next, I would like to introduce Suhag Shukla, Executive Director and co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She will be our moderator for tonight's panel. Suhag Shukla holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion and a JD from the University of Florida. Suhag has helped steer the foundation to being recognized as a leading voice for civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. She's been instrumental in the development of a broad range of educational materials and position papers and blogs for a variety of platforms. Ms. Shukla is actively involved with the Chinmaya Mission, serves on the board of the Bhutanese American Organization of Philadelphia, and is a thought partner for the Interfaith Center of Greater Philadelphia's Paths to Understanding Public Art Initiative. Shukla is a member of the board for the National Museum of American Religion and serves on religious advisory committees for the Council on Foreign Relations, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Department of Homeland Security's Subcommittee for the Prevention of Targeted Violence Against Faith-Based Communities, and is a member of the First Amendment Center's Committee on Religious Liberty and the United Nations Women's Gender Equity and Religion Platform.
Thank you, Rishi, and namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second night of our first virtual advocacy forum. We're thrilled to have two incredible experts here with us tonight to discuss Hinduism in your neighborhood, local and state issues affecting Hindu Americans. Hindu Americans have faced a number of pressing issues at the local and state level, from issues of religious liberty to misunderstandings about our teachings and sacred symbols, to hate speech and hate crimes, to bullying and stereotypes in K-12 textbooks, to issues of Hinduphobia and anti-Hindu hatred on college campuses. How can we and how can we effectively deal with these issues? How can we learn from and work with other communities facing similar issues? To discuss these issues in greater depth, we're honored to be joined by Michigan State Representative and former HAF board member, Representative Padma Kuppa, as well as Ms. Amy Feinman from our longtime partner, the Anti-Defamation League. I'll just take a minute to read their bios and then we will jump into our discussion for tonight. Representative Padma Kuppa, member of the Michigan State Assembly, is the first Indian immigrant and Hindu in the state legislature. In 2018, Padma Kuppa was elected to Michigan's 41st House District, which encompasses the cities of Troy and Clawson. For over 20 years, Padma has worked as an engineer and project manager in the automotive, financial, and IT industries. A former board member of HAF, Padma is also an active leader in her community, volunteering with the PTA throughout her children's K-12 education, founding the Troy Area Interfaith Group, and serving on Troy's Planning Commission. She is currently president of the Troy Historical Society and a board member of the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion. She currently serves as Assistant Minority Whip for the Michigan House Democrats. I've known Padma for 15 years now, initially from her work as an interfaith activist in Troy, fighting against the exclusivist National Day of Prayer commemoration that did not welcome non-Christian prayer, then as an active member of HAF's national team, and ultimately an invaluable member of our board of directors. Amy Feinman, Esquire, Northeast Area Civil Rights Counsel for the Anti-Defamation League, oversees ADL's civil rights work in 13 states and advises 5 of ADL's regional offices in New England, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, my hometown, and Washington, D.C., where HAF is headquartered, on core civil rights equities, including countering anti-Semitism and hate, fighting bigotry and discrimination, safeguarding religious freedom and the separation of church and state, and promoting immigrant and refugee rights. You can see where the overlap is with the Hindu American Foundation. Prior to joining ADL, Amy worked as a litigation associate at the law firm Latham & Watkins, LLP in Boston, where she maintained an active pro bono practice focused on education equity and juvenile justice access, or cases. Amy is a 2009 graduate of the University of Michigan and a 2012 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law. I met Amy just a few months ago, but we've had numerous exchanges brainstorming about the swastika legislation in New York that you heard about from the speaker, and also about the targeting of a Hindu American student at Brandeis University for expressing her concerns with that legislation. We'll start our panel with opening remarks by first Representative Kuppa and then Ms. Feinman for 10 minutes each. Then I'll facilitate a moderated discussion with them, and we'll conclude with a question and answer session with you, our audience. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A feature function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will not be able to answer raised hands. My colleague and HAF Director of Public Policy, Taniel Kushakshian, will be selecting questions from there, and we'll try our best to get to as many questions as possible. And don't forget to engage with us on social media using the hashtag HAF ADFO 2020. With no further ado, I invite Padma to give her opening remarks.
Namaste and thank you for everyone attending, and namaste and thank you to all my former colleagues at HAF, and new ones who have joined since I've left in 2017. It's an honor to be here as the first Hindu representing House District 41 in the great state of Michigan, the Great Lakes state. Just a little bit about myself and why I came to this place of representing a district here in the state of Michigan, and why as a Hindu it was important for me to be here, because I think it's very much the root word that we've been focusing on, dharma, dharmartha kama moksha. That's the phrase that I heard from my father growing up. My father came to the United States for graduate school, followed closely by my mother and I in 1970, and I started kindergarten that fall. My parents valued education, and they practiced their Hinduism pretty much at home, because back in 1970 until 1976, there was no temple for us to go to. And so my understanding and my recollection of Hinduism practiced in India was very minimal. I did not go back to India to visit until 1976. And I got some exposure then to worship and experience Hinduism in its land of origin, in the spiritual homeland of India. But until 1981, I did not live amongst Hindus and understand how Hinduism is learned through the ethos. However, my parents served as great role models. One of the reasons that they went back to India was to serve. They felt that they had gotten their education and then returned to India to share the knowledge. My mother's a PhD in biology. My father is a PhD in English literature and a master's in philosophy. And so they served the community that they were part of, that they were familiar with. However, I was not that familiar with the culture and the politics of India. And I was, even in college, when I went to NIT Warangal, I was an activist, always talking about women in STEM. I'm an engineer. I ended up going to the National Institute of Technology, Warangal, where I always talked about things that needed to change, like women in leadership. And so I found my way home to the United States with a foreign student visa and the $250 in US savings bonds that we cashed in from when I had grown up and won all those little essay competitions to create that Indian stereotype, right? Asian American stereotype. I came to Michigan 20 years ago plus and planned to raise my kids here. We chose a place to live because of the school district. Again, Hindu ideals led to wanting a place where we could raise a family. My son was 6 months old. My daughter was 3. My husband and I are both engineers and came for a job in the auto industry like many Indian immigrants before us. And so, like my parents, I volunteered. My father used to go back in the 70s to the PTA meetings. Well, I first started at the temple because my kids weren't in the school. And I realized that there's a certain je ne sais quoi, the ambiance, the ethos of the temple would allow my children to have that experience of being invisible in a way that they cannot be in a mainstream community as brown children. And so I then took it a step further and I volunteered in the schools when my daughter was in kindergarten. My neighbor took me and I became a member of the PTA, again, to help people, because this is our dharma, right? To help those who are in need, to help others understand our culture. I used to go in and show the kids how to make Diwali lamps out of clay. And then eventually I came to learn about how school funding happens. School funding and what's taught in schools is something that's decided at the state level, in the state budget and state policy and the State Department of Education. What we do at the federal level is also important, but the state level is where budgets are set for public school districts in pretty much every state. And so I then eventually got involved in the city, and people used to tell me I should run for something. And I did not really like the idea of politics. I had already started this interfaith organization. I really believed in pluralism, and I was part of HAF. HAF is a nonpartisan organization. I could not take on a partisan role if I meant to have an impact on the communities that we served. As members of HAF, were both Republican, Democrat, and Independent. And so I really wanted keep to that and not run for anything. Well, the time came in 2017 when I saw Betsy DeVos getting confirmed as the Secretary of Education. And for me, that was a call to action. Just as the National Day of Prayer being excluded from it in 2005 was a call to action that helped me start the interfaith work that became part of my life for the next, so many years, and caused so many phone calls between me and Suhag and so many other members, including Fred Stella, who's here on the call, and members of the temple community, the Hindu Mandir Executives Conference. And so the call to action, seeing Betsy DeVos get confirmed, it kept me up at night, because I had seen firsthand, my younger brother was born in the United States when I was in 9th grade. And when we returned to India, I saw what my parents and he had to go through for him to get a quality education. It's nothing like buying a house in a district and knowing that your child would get a decent education. And one of the things that I realized also was that the quality of education in every district is not the same. I had learned that as I advocated. And so I realized that that disparity in education had a lot to do with zip code, had a lot to do with where you lived. And we needed to change that, because that is the promise of America, that every child has access to opportunity. It's something that's there in our tradition, and it's something that I truly believe in as a critical foundation to an economy and to a democracy and to a nation. And so what better way than to run for state representative, where I could go talk to each of my neighbors and ask, will you trust me to represent you? And these are neighbors that every precinct, every neighborhood that I walked in pretty much knew somebody, right? Because I'd been working so long in the community. And so I got elected in 2018, and I got sworn in. And because there was such joy in that swearing in from people in the community, we actually did 2 swearing in ceremonies, one in the chambers, which my husband joined me for, and a couple of good friends, because that's all we were allowed. But in the district, I actually got to wear a sari and got sworn in with a Bhagavad Gita, the copy that my father gave me when I went off to college, the dog-eared copy, because it's seen so many reviews and readings, and 200 people came to that, and we really had a good experience. And then I walked into the chambers January 9th, and I really brought that willingness, that hope, that pluralism that I believed in. That the political atmosphere, really, I wasn't sure, but I was bound and determined. I really see the glass as half full. And so my first bill was the bill that was introduced by my predecessor, a Republican, and I got bipartisan support for it. And it is to protect a vulnerable adult, somebody with Down syndrome or autism, from online sexual predators. And oh my goodness, I asked and I asked and I begged and I pleaded, finally got that bill to get a hearing in May of 2019. It passed the committee unanimously. All the stakeholders agreed that it was a great bill. Slight amendment, one amendment was offered, and then it went to the second committee, where it has been sitting since last July. And so the partisan nature of politics really still is there. And this year it's worse because it's an election year. And so that's sort of my experience. And I'll tell you, I've known from the beginning that I needed to prepare for 2020, because all eyes are on the presidency and on national rhetoric. And so I need to hunker down and make sure that I do the things I'm supposed to do as a state representative, which is to represent my district. So when bills come up, I call people. I call people in the community and say, how do you feel about this? What do you think? I was thinking of co-sponsoring it. And also just the quality of the bill itself. Is there an amendment I should offer? and being able to do research on the bills that come before me. I serve on 2 committees. I serve on Energy Committee, and I serve on Local Government and Municipal Finance. I didn't think I would love the second one as much as I do, but truly it is a pleasure having served on Planning Commission and on Zoning Board and being involved in local issues to understand the impact that statewide laws can have on local communities, because local control is really important to me. I think contextually, a law can have a different impact on different communities, and so it was really important that, and so I've held my ground on some of the bills that have come before us in local government, and similarly in the Energy Committee as a former engineer in the auto industry with a real passion for the environment. We have partnered as HAF, and I have also been involved with Bhumi Project, which is now Global Bhumi. Environmental consciousness is something that truly important to me. I want to make sure that generations after us have the same planet and that we don't destroy it for them. And so those are sort of the things I'm working on. Strengthening our democracy, I'm working on additional voted home legislation, and I'm going to stop there and wait for questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Padma, and thanks for all that you're doing. If only we had more people in government who are doing that sort of due diligence. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about opportunities and challenges as we get into the evening. I want to just give a quick shout out to Dia TV that is live streaming our event. So hello to our audience who are watching this program on Dia TV. So thanks for joining us and partnering on live streaming this. Next, I will hand the Zoom box to Amy to give us 10 minutes of remarks, and then we'll go into our discussion.
Hi, everyone. So wonderful to be here this evening. Thank you so much for including me and including ADL in tonight's discussion. I think the topics that we'll address tonight are incredibly timely and important, and so important to address through an interfaith lens. So really, again, very honored to be here for this important discussion. A little bit about my background. I was motivated to start looking to work in the interfaith space, in the social justice space, in connection with the Unite the Right rally. Up until that point, I had been working at a law firm, always knew that I wanted to transition into public interest work, had a master plan to pay off my loans very strategically and continue to do pro bono work on the side. But that event, I think, really was a turning point for me to get engaged in this work a lot sooner than I otherwise expected to. And for me at the time, I had grown up culturally Jewish, very connected to the Jewish religion, but not as religious as some of my peers. And so it certainly was a learning curve going to the ADL and learning about anti-Semitism in a way that I really hadn't learned before growing up. And so at the time, I was looking for an organization that was committed not only to addressing the rise in anti-Semitism, but also in securing justice and fair treatment for all, which is part of ADL's core mission statement. And so one of the main reasons that I was drawn to ADL was in light of its dual mission to not only stop the defamation of the Jewish people, but also address hatred and bigotry against all marginalized communities and all faith communities. And from ADL's perspective, we really see hatred and bias and discrimination as connected, and that no one group is safe until all of us are safe to, live our lives with freedom and dignity and respect, and that we all must work together in order to realize, our nation's founding ideals and promises. And so since joining ADL, I have been involved in a number of our projects, both dedicated to stopping anti-Semitism, but also to eradicating discrimination and working on addressing the rise in hate crimes that we have certainly seen in recent years. ADL itself is also a 501c3 nonprofit organization, also nonpartisan. We have offices all across the US and a number of different departments. So I specifically work in our civil rights legal department. my primary focus is on furthering our state and local civil rights objectives. Most recently, my work has focused on immigration rights, criminal justice reform, and also on education equity. And I'm glad to elaborate on those topics as we get further into the discussion. But one of the things that I appreciate so much about ADL is our flexibility in the civil rights space to follow the lead of coalition partners on the ground with respect to what issues are most important, what should we be prioritizing, and how can ADL lend its unique voice in light of our civil rights experience and also our faith perspective, which often is actually very valuable when it comes to civil rights protections. So for me, in addition to the state and local civil rights work, I also work really closely with coalition partners on filing amicus briefs on core civil rights issues. We have partnered with HAF on numerous occasions in connection with those amicus briefs. One of our biggest concerns in the faith community at this point is efforts to use religious freedom as a sword to discriminate against others rather than a shield for faith. That has come up most recently in the foster care context, where faith-based foster care agencies have discriminated against LGBTQ couples in terms of placing children. We have seen in South Carolina a similar effect where faith-based foster care agencies are discriminating against Jewish parents in terms of child placement. And so what the broader faith-based community is saying in that context is that that type of discrimination opens the door to discrimination against religious minorities. So individuals who don't adhere to the majority faith in a particular country, here in the US, for example, are therefore subject to further discrimination when it comes not only to the foster care context, but really in all other contexts. And so doing that type of work has been incredibly rewarding. We've been able to build broad faith-based consensus on a number of our core civil rights priorities, and really looking right now at the intersection of the 14th Amendment and the First Amendment when it comes to religious liberty and non-discrimination protections. Another part of my work, as I mentioned, focuses on hate crime advocacy. So when it comes to hate crime laws, we see all different models in all different states across the country. And there are some models that are much stronger than others. Some states in our country still don't have hate crime laws. And we know that anti-Hindu hate crimes, anti-Jewish hate crimes are on the rise across the board in all respects. And so what we have seen, particularly in recent years, is a rise in what we're calling the intentional selection of victims based on a protected characteristic, in our case, based on religion. Based on a belief or perception about that religion. So hate crimes can manifest in all different ways. It can manifest based on a number of different underlying crimes. And a lot of our work, both with civil rights partners and with faith-based communities, involves strengthening and improving those hate crimes. Another part of my job, which I think is also relevant to tonight's discussion, is incident response. We are often contacted by constituents who have concerns that they were the victim of anti-Semitism or discrimination. Most recently, we've been working very closely with students on college campuses who are very concerned about a rise in anti-Semitism that is being or is manifesting in some really unique ways. So one parallel that I think we'll discuss tonight is a trend that we are seeing, particularly in the Jewish community, that involves holding Jewish students accountable for actions of Israel. And we have seen that manifest in so many different ways, from bias incidents to hate crimes on campus. And sometimes that conflation is really difficult to parse out. So we've been working very closely with other Jewish organizations, other faith communities, to build out education materials to prepare college students to address hate and bias on college campuses, and certainly in K through 12 schools. It's an area that we're still continuing to focus on. And then, finally, we at ADL are really focused and concerned about the rise in hate online and the role that tech platforms are playing in perpetuating some of that hate and bigotry. And so we've been devising some strategies, both coalition building strategies and legal strategies, to address those concerns, to ensure that everyone is safe and free from hatred, discrimination, harassment in the online context. So really looking forward to tonight's discussion and touching on all of these topics.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you both for like staying completely on time. I didn't have to interrupt, so I'm really grateful for that. Let's just jump straight into our questions. And Amy, you kind of touched upon it in terms of college campuses. So I'm going to start there. You know, you brought up how oftentimes criticism of Israeli government actions veers into anti-Semitism on college campuses and the impact that that has on Jewish students. We've been seeing something similar in terms of criticism of the Indian government veering into Hindu phobia or anti-Hindu rhetoric. And very often it's professors, scholar activists, I suppose, who are driving it. Sometimes it's campus organizations that are student organizations. And the end result is really Hindu students feeling deeply uncomfortable. Most recently, we saw the use of Holi, one of our very inclusive holidays, one of those holidays where people come together to celebrate friendship and peace and love, that was used to make a political statement against the Indian government and its policies. And so students who wanted to celebrate were fearful of doing so. And students are also fearful of speaking up. Their grades depend sometimes on kind of towing the line of a professor who might be veering into that line. So I'm going to pitch this question to both of you. Maybe Amy, you can go first, and then Padma. So to Amy, how has the Jewish community dealt with this? And then, that's going to give us kind of an opportunity to learn from what you all have been doing. And I'm sure there's not just one approach. So maybe I should be more specific and say, what is ADL doing? Because I think, all of our communities are internally very diverse. And to Padma, what can the Hindu community do to support students? Because I know you're very much in touch with these issues and have seen them beyond the college campus as well. So what can we do better? So Amy, go ahead.
Sure. So unfortunately, there are no easy answers here. It is a very, very complex and complicated issue that we are, grappling with too at ADL. I'll provide just a few examples of some issues that we have seen on campus and how we've navigated them. Again, I don't think there's a roadmap, and I think the best approach that we have found is to follow the lead of Jewish students on campus. We typically contact the local Hillel, which is the Jewish center, cultural center on campus, in the first instance whenever we learn about an incident of anti-Semitic hate or bias, just to get a better sense of how students on the ground are feeling about an incident, what will be helpful, what will be harmful, what would add more fuel to the fire. Sometimes, ADL is asked to, stay silent for a little bit and see if the students on campus can reach a resolution, because at the end of the day, those students are going to have to continue to go to class, continue to experience, lectures from XYZ professor, continue to interact with the administration. And we want to make sure that we're providing resources and support and following the lead of the campus communities. But most recently, there have been a number of incidents that I think are relevant to our discussion today. One involved a professor at the University of Michigan who initially agreed to write a letter of recommendation for a student who wished to study abroad. And when the professor learned that the student wanted to study abroad in Israel, he actually retracted the offer and essentially said that in light of my own political beliefs connected to the BDS movement, which is a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, I am going to abstain from writing a letter of recommendation for you. Wow. And this was a really complicated issue on campus because on the one hand, you have a professor who has his own political viewpoints, political beliefs, not endorsed by the university. The university itself did not adhere to BDS, so certainly still had exchange programs in Israel. But from our perspective, what we were most concerned about is the academic freedom aspect, that students should on college campuses have the opportunity to learn and explore in whatever capacity resonates most with them. And what better way to learn about issues related to Israel-Palestine than to travel to Israel and learn directly from folks on the ground. And so ADL did some really public advocacy on that issue, making sure that the student felt supported, that the university was able to provide an alternative support for that student so that she could still get a letter of recommendation and actually participate in that study abroad program. But certainly that was one incident that was really challenging to navigate, really hurtful, I think, for many Jewish students on campus who saw this as a reflection of the university itself and not just the individual views of this particular professor. We've also seen, and this relates to, I think, religious holidays generally, in Judaism, there's a holiday called Sukkot, and it's supposed to be a very exciting holiday where you build a sukkah, which is a temporary structure, and enjoy food and wine inside. And on several campuses, we saw sukkahs defaced with language "Free Gaza," which again is conflating Judaism, the Jewish people, with actions that the perpetrators believe were unjustified by the state of Israel. And so there was a lot of discussion at the time, both with law enforcement and campus officials, as to whether that crossed the line into a hate crime or whether it was simply a bias incident. And from ADL's perspective, that's one example where, due to that conflation, due to the intentional selection of a structure based on a belief or perception about a protected characteristic, whether it's religion or national origin, as long as those criteria are met, that does rise to the level of a hate crime. But more importantly, whether you call something a bias incident or a hate crime doesn't, really address the experience of Jewish students on campus who are much more reluctant to outwardly celebrate Jewish holidays moving forward, much less inclined to, join Jewish affinity groups. And so how do you address those issues on campus? And every situation is different. Sometimes it involves the university issuing a strong statement about the incident. One thing that we tell universities is that even universities that are constrained by the First Amendment, while all speech might be protected, not all speech should be given equal weight. And so that doesn't preclude a university from speaking out when there is a hate or bias incident. It doesn't preclude a university from hosting an alternative forum for students when controversial speakers come to campus to ensure that everyone feels safe and protected. Doesn't negate the possibility of a university having an open door policy for students who are concerned. So there's so many different ways and approaches to address the concerns that we're seeing, and would love to hear from Padma as well with respect to issues that the Hindu community is grappling with.
Padma? If you could unmute, there we go.
Yeah. So I have two children who are in college, and I know that not only when they were in college were there not any opportunities for Hindu students to come together. Even in high school, there was a Muslim Student Association, there was no Hindu Student Association. And so that's the question that I have for the parents who are watching, who are attending this, that what can we as Hindu parents do to help our children have a stronger compass and encourage them to have, because I think it starts at home. In 9th grade, Suhag will remember, my daughter is older than her elder child, and my younger child graduated high school the same year, but my older child is a girl activist, kind of like me. And she was studying 9th grade, and her teacher told her the Abrahamics were the original monotheists. My goodness, my daughter took that up with a bang, and she not only interviewed Suhag Shukla, the executive director of the HAF, she interviewed professors, the mandir, the priest at the mandir, just everyone she could find, to point out that, in fact, Hinduism also has a monotheistic strain, right? We are both monotheists and polytheists at the same time. And so, her teacher allowed her to present because she was in an IB curriculum. And then eventually she got a lot of backlash. You know from whom? Her fellow Hindu students, that she was making a fuss. And she ended up writing an essay about that, and for an MLK competition, about the silence of our friends, right? Not the voices of our enemies being the challenge. And so she started the Dharmic Students Association at Bryn Mawr when she was a college student there. And my son has been, so I think it's on us. Swami Dayanand Saraswati ji said at one Hindu Mandir conference that we need to change if we want our children to be more empowered. But I want to share with you a recent experience. Last November, Somebody introduced me, Asha Shipman, the Yale Hindu chaplain, introduced me to a young man, Cody Nielsen. Dr. Nielsen is the founder of an organization called Convergence on Campus. Now, I don't have a college campus other than a small business college, Walsh College. I don't have like a residential college in my district, but I have two colleagues who do. I also have a Muslim colleague. So I brought all of them to the table and staff who are interested. And we had Dr. Nielsen come to the Capitol. And we held a meeting about what Convergence on Campus does to see if we can get an initiative going. So basically, Convergence empowers colleges to provide religious accommodation, to enhance institutional climate for religious, secular, and spiritual identities through policy and practice. So that if I'm fasting on Sivaratri, I don't have to go take my exam. I can let my professor know, you know what, this is a holy day for me. I'm fasting at Shivaratri. Can I take the exam tomorrow? I know it's important to many of us for whatever reason. I know that Suhag fasts during Navratri. And so just if our children decide to have some, I know that when I was a PTA parent, PTA board member in my children's school, we had parent-teacher conferences scheduled on the nights of Diwali and the Gujarati New Year. And I raised a ruckus about it. I basically said, you can't do this because all of us want to go home and celebrate Diwali, and they changed it. And it had been set in the teacher's contract that was the night, so they had to do a whole lot of changes. But, you know, we have to raise our voices. And I think the thing that came out of the Convergence meeting, though, was there's a Muslim Student Association president from MSU that came. And so I asked him, because Cody was going to reach out to Hillel and this young man was here. And I said, do you know any Hindu student organization on campus? And he's, well, there's CIUS, which is a Council of Indian Undergraduate Students. But most of it, what they do is centered on dance and music, on performative activity, not on religious, spiritual, inward-looking activity. And so I said, well, you know, I would love your help if you can help me round up a few students who self-identify as Hindu to see if we can start a group that will help you with Convergence on Campus and working with them. Nothing has happened since. As I said, you know, I don't have the university in my district so that I can take the lead on these things. And I'm hopeful that some of my colleagues will, but I also have coming into the legislature 2 other Indian Americans. One is Sikh, married to a Hindu, and one is a Marathi. I believe he's Hindu. So hopefully they'll be able to help me push this and encourage this. But we also have a lot of others in the community, in the religious community in the legislature. And so I've been talking to them about how we can advance education to be more inclusive. And so whether it's the MDE or the Michigan Department of Education or through colleges and universities, just talking to people. And I think it really starts at the local level. I know that Fairfax, Virginia was a model for me in how we engaged, and we brought, you know, Murali Balaji, when he was the director of education, to work with the Troy School District. He was at HAF, and so, you know, doing those things, I think, are the best way to ensure that our children and our young adults have the language to be able to navigate these spaces, to have those dinner table conversations when they hear something from their professor that doesn't sync with what happens or what is said at home. I think it starts locally.
Thanks, Padma. And I really like your emphasis on taking action and standing up. You know, there are Hindu student organizations. So if any of the people watching, if their children, college age, are interested in starting something, there's a plethora of resources. There's Hindu Student Association, there's Hindu Student Council. Both my sons ended up doing something independent on their respective campuses. So there is a lot of opportunity, but you have to take that first step. But before they can even take that first step, we as families need to kind of plant that seed. And there's also resources on Anti-Defamation League's website that I have been eyeing for a very long time. And Amy, I know that that was one of the first things that I had reached out to you about, is who put these college materials together, because there is translatability for any students who might be facing. This is not about legitimate criticism about some foreign governments' policies. It's about when that veers into anti-Hindu hatred. And also we have to take into consideration the asymmetry of power, especially when it's professors who are doing it. So I might have to also talk to you offline. I actually had a student, Amy, who reached out. A professor refused to be on her thesis committee because of her perspective. That's not a professor who is modeling free expression or academic freedom. So now let's shift gears a little bit to state level policy. And so I'll pose this to both of you because you both have experience in this, but we've seen the most recent example would be the swastika legislation in New York that is seeking to teach the swastika as only a symbol of hate, which we know that many see it as that. But it also has a thousands of year old history of it being an ancient sacred symbol, not just Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists, but even Native American cultures. So how can we as communities work together to both educate and acknowledge the sacred and positive aspects of this symbol, as well as acknowledge and be sensitive to the pain and suffering the misappropriated Nazi version of the symbol has caused? Let's start with you, Amy.
Sure. Yeah, I think education is absolutely critical. So, you know, part of the work that we need to do together is educate about both meanings, both the longstanding historic meaning of the swastika to many faith communities that continues to this day, and also educate young people and adults about the Nazi appropriation of the swastika and how that swastika is also used today to terrorize Jewish communities in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And so it's, I think, the most important thing we can do is educate. And certainly when it comes to that New York bill, we have to be really careful and intentional about the language, and not only just the language of the legislation, but also what the New York curricular framework looks like to ensure that whatever is actually being taught in K through 12 schools reflects both perspectives, so that students can understand that when they see, you know, a swastika on the home of a Hindu family, that they are not, you know, shocked or, you know, misperceive what that means, just as when, you know, someone sees a swastika scrawled on a synagogue next to the words white power, that too is interpreted in the appropriate manner. So a lot of it comes down to context and intent. That's exactly how we evaluate hate crimes when they take place. So for me, it's education and context and intent. And at the same time, have to be really, really careful when we try to legislate these issues. Even in the context of hate crimes, there are some states that, you know, I think are very well-meaning and acting in good faith when they attempt to create a rebuttable presumption that scrawling the swastika on a building is, you know, de facto evidence of a hate crime. And that's just not necessarily the case. And that also raises First Amendment concerns. And as faith communities, we want to be really sensitive to the First Amendment. So, you know, the one additional thing that I will add that I think is relevant to this discussion is, you know, in the West, the triggering effect of the swastika in the Jewish community, I think, is really significant for several reasons, not only in light of the misappropriation, but also in light of the way in which anti-Semitism functions, which is a bit unique relative to other forms of oppression. So sometimes anti-Semitism is described as cyclical in nature. There are periods of safety and stability, and then periods of anti-Jewish sentiment and hatred and violence. And a lot of it is connected to an anti-Semitic stereotype that the Jewish people are secretly very powerful and exercise undue control over the government and other aspects of individuals' lives. And in order for that myth to gain some traction, oftentimes those in power do enable the Jewish people to gain some form of power, some form of control. And so sometimes the Jewish community is perceived as being very powerful, having more control than I think is actually the case. And so there's a perpetual fear within the Jewish community, and I know I'm speaking in general terms, but I think in light of the cyclical nature, the fact that after long periods of stability, things can change so quickly, in light of the fact that, you know, the Jewish people aren't in control in the societies that we live in, the fact that that can change so quickly, I think makes the swastika a uniquely harmful symbol in the way in which it was misappropriated by the Nazis. So it provides a little bit of perspective. There are some in the Jewish community who say that our fear of the swastika, maybe it's an irrational fear. People try to make sense of it, but a lot of it is rooted, I think, in the horrors of the Holocaust and then this unique manifestation of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Amy. Padma?
Fortunately, we haven't seen any legislation like that in Michigan, but it is so important to have voices that can then speak to those issues when they do come up. And I actually want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we've been able to do in the legislature, and that is to have a Diwali proclamation. And not only have we had a Diwali proclamation because other representatives before me have done that, but also this year, this session in 2019, in October, late October, I was able to offer that resolution and also give a floor speech. And if you haven't seen it, many of my Republican colleagues came over and they were like, it makes sense to them now. Right? The point of a floor speech is to be able to speak to whatever it is that's being voted on and to explain it in the context of my childhood growing up with people who celebrated Christmas, and then relate it back to, you know, how I celebrated Diwali in India and how Diwali is a festival of light for people all over the world. And just that's education at the most basic that I've been able to do as a state legislator. But I would say that my interfaith work was really where I was able to educate people about the swastika. There's a famous person in Chinmaya circles, if people know DC Rao, who used to live in the DC area. He worked with the Metropolitan Interfaith Council in the DC metro area, and they have a beautiful brochure explaining the swastika that he worked on with members of the Jewish community and the broader interfaith community. And it is just, it's a phenomenal publication that I've used so many times in interfaith settings, trying to get people to understand what it means to us and what it means to the Jewish community. And again, basic local education is the most impactful way to do it.
Thanks, Padma. That reminds me also of the historic Hindu-Jewish dialogue that occurred between the Hindu Dharma Acharya Sabha and the Chief Rabbinate. And they came up with some, it was an opportunity for dialogue and educating one another about their respective traditions and dispelling some of these stereotypes and misunderstanding. I am now going to turn the floor over to Tanyel. I'm sure there are many, many questions that have come through. If you have not, again, we're not using the raise hand feature. We are using the Q&A feature. So please put any of your questions. We will try to get to as many as we can. And with that, Tanyel.
Thank you, Suhag. Wow, thank you all so much. What an excellent discussion this evening. Thank you, Padma and Amy. We have had and have been collecting over 50 different questions that have come in over the Q&A over the last hour since we started. And I really like where the conversation was going. So I'm going to try to piggyback off of the flow that you already had. And we had a couple of questions from Asha Bajaj, and the questions was, we'd like to hear more about Hindu advocacy in your term of office, Padma, and she asked they asked a really quick question. Shouldn't we be sensitive in communities with big Jewish presence to avoid using the swastika in public places? And I thought that was a very interesting approach and question. So I wanted you, Padma, if you could talk a little bit about her first part of the question and then maybe unravel part of the second part.
So if I understand it correctly, the first question is, what am I doing for Hindu advocacy as a representative? And how do I maintain the sort of secular and religious, right? And so just as a simple point, my job is to be a state representative, to represent the constituents, connect them with resources at the state government, and to represent all of my constituents. So I have constituents who are Hindu, I have constituents who are Muslim, I have constituents who are probably not committed to any particular faith. I have secular and atheists. One of my city councilwomen actually considers herself atheist. So, you know, I have to represent all of them. So there's not really a role for me to do Hindu advocacy as such. What I can do as a Hindu is let people know when something is good or bad. And so one of the things, I have a Jewish colleague who sits diagonal to me on the floor. And so whenever we have an invocation, every day that session is taking place, we have an invocation. And so I look at him and he looks at me after the invocation is over, and we go, okay, today we're going to hell. Because the prayer was not inclusive. One of my colleagues has a temple in her district, a Hindu temple in her district. And so she invited the priest from the mandir. And so he did not provide a translation. And so I took it upon myself to provide the translation and emailed it to my colleagues so that they would know and they would understand what he had said, because he had only 2 minutes. When I had the opportunity to invite a guest, I invited my very good friend who's a Presbyterian minister who's retired, and asked her, you know, can you say a prayer that's reflective of our district? And the other, there's one Muslim in the legislature, he's from Dearborn, and Representative Hamoud came up to my friend and he said, this is the first time that I've been in the legislature, he's serving his second term, it's the first time that I haven't felt that I'm going to hell. So, you know, the idea for me is to model being a good Hindu in how I am. And that itself is how I believe in pluralism. And that is the concept of Ekam Sat, Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti, or I believe that the whole world is my family. So my constituents, my neighbors are important to me. And so that is how I advocate. And that is how I represent. I will say I was very fortunate. One day I was invited to the governor's house for a women's event where she had invited people in the legislature, people in the departments, the department heads, the Supreme Court and the executive branch. And she had this women's event in the early September. And so she mentioned that she has been a much more approachable governor. I don't know if you've heard her name, probably, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Big Gretch. And so Gretchen said that she has opened up her home, unlike her predecessor who didn't live in the governor's residence. She not only lives there with her family, but she also tries to make it accessible to people. And as I was walking out that evening, she mentioned during the course of her remarks to us that she's hosted a variety of events, a Blue Star Mothers event, a dinner for Eid, you know, during Iftar dinner. And so when I was leaving, I asked her staff, I said, hey, do you think she'd host a Diwali reception? And lo and behold, I got permission. We took all the 12 temples or 14 temples in each of the areas and major areas where there are Hindus across the state. Unfortunately, Fred Stella was not able to join us, but he got us guests from the west side of the state because he's on this side and I'm over here on this side. And so we had a phenomenal event. We had the first board certified Hindu chaplain in the state of Michigan of Indian origin, Shama Mehta. She gave the invocation, and you know, you could just feel the power of the governor opening up her home and welcoming everyone in and celebrating with us. And she mentioned it in her State of the State this year that she held a Diwali reception. So, I mean, there's little things that we can do because diversity is a given, right? Diversity is a given. People are different. It's about counting people. getting a seat at the table, that's inclusion. But belonging is when your voice is heard. And so when we were able to say the prayers alongside Shama that day, when she did the invocation prayer, and the governor lit the lamp, and I lit the diyas with the governor, you know, it made me feel like I belonged.
Like you had a seat at the table, like you said.
Yeah, it's more than just a seat at the table, right? It's a sense of belonging
And inclusion.
So that your voice is heard. You know, just because you're at the table doesn't mean that your voice is heard. And so that's, I think, really the power of finding that, getting a seat at the table and making your voice heard, but then having the other side hear it.
That's great that you've had that such positive experience. In fact, there was actually some questions on the contrary, wondering if you faced Hindu phobia. Both Dilip Amin and Mahir Merghani asked about Hindu phobia. There are groups out there targeting Hindu elected politicians or Hindu candidates. And have you faced anything like that, Padma? And how does that make you feel? You know, have you, you know, what recourse do you have? And aside from education, and please we'll talk about that, because you know, in addition to people, Hindu Americans at the civic level, which we know are under attack in states like Washington and in Illinois, you know, as an elected official, is that something you face?
Yes, I have been targeted. I don't want to give them importance by naming them, but there are definitely social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, where a number of people are targeting me. And I have to say, we did a Hanukkah Diwali event in Troy with the Troy Interfaith Group in 2017. It was sort of my last major event I did as an HAF member in November of 2017 as a member of the board, and also an active member leading the effort here in Michigan. And Fred Stella and the then head of, David Kurzman, the head of the JCRC AJC here in Metro Detroit, talked about Hindu advocacy and Jewish advocacy, and I moderated that panel. Well, last year in November, we did a similar thing for Hanukkah Diwali. Instead, we had State Representative Padma Kuppa and State Senator Jeremy Moss, who is Jewish, moderated by our very own Fred Stella. And so we had a repeat of that recently on Sunday under the umbrella of the Center for Civil Discourse here in Detroit, Detroit Center for DetroitCivilDiscourse.org.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were wrapping up, someone came in and we had an open chat where people could submit their questions through chat. And this person put in 3 questions asking me about, you know, my connections to Hindu fascists and RSS. And I'll have to tell you, I never ran for anything before. No one in my family has ever run for anything before. I actually left India because I didn't understand India's multi-party crazy political system. And I understand American democracy, not the parliamentary system, because that's what I was raised with. I went from kindergarten to 10th grade here. And I knew that I was better off working in the American political system. I've had constituents write to me, both those who are concerned about the plight of Kashmiris and Muslims in Kashmir, as well as people who are frustrated with the media and the rhetoric around the CAA. So I have the whole spectrum. And usually what I'll do is I'll say, thank you very much for reaching out to me. I'm a state representative. Please correspond with your federal level elected officials. Gary Peters is our state senator. Haley Stevens is my congresswoman, and both of them have taken the time to understand that this is a very multi-layered historical, just as like we can't solve world hunger, there are other things that I as a state representative can't solve. And so it really has to happen at the local level, where you engage in dialogue with your neighbors and explain to them why you support X or Y. I will say that the rhetoric around me and attacking mine, I have actually brought it to the attention of Facebook, because I think it's very unfair that I'm targeted like this. And I've also bringing it to the attention of Democratic leadership, starting with the Michigan Democratic Party and my own party leadership, my own caucus leadership. Hopefully
I'm so sorry to hear that you faced that.
Yeah, I'll say one thing that Jeremy said, Senator Moss said on Sunday that really spoke to me. He said, you know, Netanyahu does something. The Jewish community in Israel reacts a certain way. The Jewish community in America reacts a certain way, and I have a different reaction. There's no straight line. In fact, the Jewish community in Israel doesn't agree with everything that Netanyahu is doing. The Jewish community is all over the place. And I would say the same thing. You know, nobody has the exact same opinion as somebody else. And so whether it's about India, whether it's about Modi, we are all over the place as Indian Americans. Some of us don't care. Some of us care a lot. And I think that asking me to answer for what happens in India doesn't make sense. If you want to work on something, go live there and fix it. Yeah. I care about Troy and Lawson, and that's why I, you know, got elected to represent this district.
Well, let me continue the conversation here. I want to bring Amy and Padma to kind of elaborate on this one question. It was an anonymous attendee who shout out to Florida, said that there was actually the first time ever a Diwali celebration at the governor's mansion here in Florida last year. And that was the first time that happened. But continuing the discussion on college campuses, you know, what resources other than Hindu Student Associations can be provided to students when university or faculty actually gets involved, when professors promote anti-Semitic or Hindu-phobic views? There's a professor at Rutgers, a historian, who's backed by that school and has put out anti or Hindu or Hindu-phobic elements. And so have you faced something like that? Amy, I know you talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to, maybe you can expand on that a little bit more, on that crossover. And then maybe Suhag, you can weigh in as well on that topic, because I know college campus issues is something that you've been very much involved with, as having two sons who are in college right now.
Yes, so we certainly have faced very similar issues. I think in some cases, we will issue public statements on social media. We will write op-eds regarding the content of something that a professor has said or done. A lot of times engaging with the administration in the campus community, and sometimes that's not a letter or an email, it's actually a private meeting to express concerns and express, you know, not only disagreement with a professor's views, but more importantly, the impact that those the statements by the professor is having on students, the fact that it's alienating some students from, you know, gaining the full benefit of an education on that particular college's campus. So I think really advocacy organizations like HAF, like ADL, have a lot of those relationships in place and can help facilitate introductions, facilitate conversations, and really make sure that the right folks on the ground are looking into issues and providing as much support to students as possible. I also think, you know, from ADL's perspective, we've done a lot of work to provide education materials to college students about the issues that they're likely to face on college campuses.
And how are those received? Because I'm sure you get a couple of different reactions, right? I mean, it's not always the same. So what kind of reactions do you get sometimes? I mean, are they always like kind of in the middle, or are they far apart sometimes?
So it really depends. There's so much disagreement within the Jewish community right now about what anti-Semitism is, what anti-Israel bias is, what anti-Zionism is. And so we do our best based on our own expertise and historical knowledge to provide guideposts for students to then do their own learning. And we try to provide as balanced of an approach as possible, but it's very challenging. I think just putting materials out there and engaging students in that way for them to then have a launching point to go do their own research and learning is really important. So I think the benefits of us putting out materials outweigh the risks, but it's a really challenging time, I think, in many faith communities to build consensus and have agreement. And it's, you know, I think part of the hard work that we do.
And I think you would classify that as student empowerment, right? Or as youth empowerment. Give them the tools, lead them to water, and let it blossom. And Suhag, maybe I would like to hear your comments on this as someone who is a parent of college students, Hindu American college students today.
Sure. I think that two people are well placed. Of course, advocacy organizations have a role to play, but oftentimes it's limited. But the two most powerful entities in that equation are students and alumni. So, colleges depend on alumni to support the school financially. And unfortunately, where we're in kind of an educational industry, that's what it takes. It ends with the dollar. So if you are, whatever school you went to, keep an eye on how things are going and make your dollars speak. That's how other communities have ensured that their campuses are not just dedicated to free speech and academic freedom, because what we're seeing way too often is that certain viewpoints are allowed and others are canceled. And so in order to ensure that there's freedom of expression and academic freedom, alumni and students both, I think, are well placed to push against anything that you see that is kind of going against those ideals. For students, I think very often, for Hindu students at least, the biggest obstacle is not knowing our history. And, to what Padma has been emphasizing throughout the evening, we need to know our tradition, we need to know our teachings, and we need to know our history. And we come from a community where our history has largely been defined by Europeans. And so we're just seeing emerging scholarship.
And then being American, I'm sure, adds another layer to that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that the two primary issues that we're seeing really ratchet up the tension on college campuses, as well as city councils, is the abrogation of Article 370, which basically extended the constitutional rights and equal protection that India guarantees all its citizens to the residents of Kashmir. So that's one issue that's been kind of being used as a platform to, in many cases, silence Hindu American students, and the Citizenship Amendment Act. And I'll make a plug for HAF that we have a plethora of simple educational resources on both the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is one that we have been promoting in terms of seeking some sort of some sort of legal status for refugees. We've worked for a decade with refugees in a camp in Rajasthan, Pakistani Hindus and Christians who have escaped because they have to live and they're relegated to second-class citizenship. And what does the CAA mean for them? We have a number of resources that students can turn to. And then I'll also plug our Dharma Advocates program. That is going to be coming up October 1st, that very often it's not just, some of us may know all of the history, or we may have our own perspective on these issues or be well read about them. But how does policy work? What's the scope of a city council? How do you advocate? How is a law made? All those things are the step-by-step process that the Dharma Advocates program will empower not just college students, but community members with.
I also want to just jump in and talk about college students and my legislative team and my campaign team. They are so critical. My office in the legislature is known for having the most students, because I realized when I got there and I saw how polarized politics is, that I needed students to see it. I needed them. I don't care if you're going to be a doctor or an engineer. Come volunteer with whoever is your representative. If you're a Democrat, you want to volunteer with a Republican, go for it. Volunteer in your state representative's office for a semester, because it is so important. And if you can't get to if you're in high school, go volunteer in the city government. Understand how government works, because without it, democracy dies. Without informed voters, without us understanding. This is again, illumination. Why light is so important in it's the symbology of light. Light is knowledge. So learn about how government works at all levels, not just voting for president, voting for Congress, because I see so many people do that and they don't go, who's your county commissioner? What do they do?
We're even getting questions on federal issues right now, and this is a local and state panel. So, that's right
to me, it's always been the heart of government is like knowing who you can go talk to about when your road isn't paved, when you open your tap and your water isn't clean. If all of you have not heard of what happened in Flint, it could happen anywhere in this country because our infrastructure is aging. And so I think it's so important. I left India because I wanted water out of my tap. I remember getting so frustrated as a 15-year-old. I took it for granted, right? Open your tap and you can drink your water out of it. And in India, you can't do that. And so for me, those are simple things that make up my life in America that I want to ensure that we continue to have. And so, these are the values that I share with my neighbors. It's not a Hindu value. This is just, shared values that we have as wanting our children to get educated, wanting to be able to open our tap, wanting infrastructure that's reliable. But Midland just had a dam break and, we're fixing it after. And people were affected deeply. And so like even now, healthcare. Right, and what the lack of healthcare has done for people during COVID.
And I think what you're touching on right now are some issues where I think a Hindu approach could be the resolution to some of those answers when you talk about climate change and food and our food supply and food chain and things like that, which opens a whole nother discussion, which unfortunately we don't have the time to get into as we come to our close here, 5 minutes to 9. I'm going to go ahead, 4 minutes to 9, go ahead and turn it back over to Suhag. Thank you for all the people who asked questions. We had over 80 questions here tonight. Some of them I didn't answer or didn't read out loud, but the discussion itself, I think, answered so many of the questions that came through. And I'm glad that we were able to read those that also came in and helped steer the conversation in the way that which I was very much entertained and fascinated by, and I hope you all were as well. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to our HAF Executive Director, Suhag Shukla, to close. And one thing I may want to say here is, if there's one takeaway both Amy and Padma want to give or our listeners to and viewers to take away from this program, what is it?
Amy, maybe you can take it first.
Sure. I think that for me, it's stay active, stay involved, stay educated. Your voice is really powerful and meaningful. And there are so many advocacy organizations out there to support you, provide education materials, legislative advocacy materials, whatever you're most interested in or passionate about. It really, really makes a difference. And we see that every day at ADL.
I was going to say volunteer. Find a cause that you care about and volunteer. And that will lead you to advocate on that issue, because if you care about the environment, get involved and help save it. It's really the issue of our lifetimes. And if you want to do it through your professional path, do it through your professional path. It doesn't have to be separate from your employment. And I think that seeing Suhag, it's always a pleasure, because she took her law degree and she reached out to me in 2005. She said, do you need any help? Do you need any legal help? Because I was on the front page of the Detroit Free Press because I'd been denied my rights. And so, it can be through your profession, it can be through volunteerism, but just advocate, take your voice and use it.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and answer that too. I'll just say that both educate yourself, not just about the issues, but our tradition, because there's so much inspiration there. Our tradition encourages us to seek truth, to be discerning in the types of media that we're taking in and the type of language that we use to then speak out and advocate. So that would be my takeaway. We are running up at 8:59, so I want to really, really thank you Padma and Amy for just such a robust conversation on how we can become more engaged at the local and state level and on college campuses. I want to thank our staff for all their efforts. We had to pivot from usually what is a boisterous 2 days where at the end of the evening we get to dress up for a big reception on Capitol Hill. But in this virtual format, we've been able to open it up to far more people than are usually able to take 3-4 days off and travel to DC. A big thanks to Dia TV for live streaming the event. A reminder that Dharma Advocates training is coming up on August 1st. You can register at www.hinduamerican.org and go to upcoming events. Space is limited. And if you just stay on for 45 seconds longer, we have a short clip to end our forum, which showcases for who we do what we do. Thank you.
I am an actor.
I am a teacher.
I'm a comedian.
I am a doctor.
A football player.
A mother.
A priest.
A field hockey player. A violinist.
A yoga instructor.
A dancer.
A writer.
An artist.
I'm a Mayflower descendant.
A Texan.
Aloha. I'm Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, and I am Hindu.
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 I am Hindu American.
Namaste, good night, stay safe, stay well. Good night.